Have you ever made a split-second decision that changed the entire course of your life? Not just your day, not just your week, but your entire existence? What would you do if, in the blink of an eye, your fate became entangled with someone from another world, someone you didn't even know existed? The scent of spice, oil, and alien incense hung heavy in the humid air of the new Thessaly open market. Neon signs blinked in alien alphabets above stalls overflowing with shimmering fabrics, strange fruits, and off-world technology. It was noisy, chaotic, alive, just the way Jonas Cade liked it. A former Earth soldier turned cargo hauler, he blended in among the crowd, just another face among traders, pickpockets, and wanderers looking for the next deal. But beneath his calm exterior, there was always a hum of vigilance. Habits formed in war don't die easily. He didn't come to this planet looking for trouble. He came to sell salvaged engine parts. But trouble has a way of finding people like him, those who know how to fight but no longer want to. As he moved past a row of food stalls, a sudden hush fell over the crowd. It was subtle, like the silence before a storm. Then he heard it. The twang of a bowstring, sharp and unmistakable. A cry rang out. And then he saw her. At the far end of the alley, a woman in a deep violet cloak sprinted between vendors, her face half hidden, her stride elegant but desperate. Behind her, two armored figures moved with deadly intent, bows raised. The arrow was already in flight. Jonas didn't think. He moved. Muscle memory took over. In a single motion he leapt forward, crashing through baskets of fruit and vendors' crates. His body collided with hers just as the arrow was about to strike. He spun mid-air, pulling her down with him, shielding her with his own back. The arrow hit hard, burying deep between his shoulder blade and spine. The world exploded in a blur of noise and color. The pain was immense but distant, like a fire burning at the edge of awareness. He landed hard, the alien woman beneath him gasping in surprise. Around them, panic erupted. He remembered her face, just a flash. A shimmer of gold in her eyes, a strange symbol tattooed just beneath her left jaw. And then everything went black. When he woke, he wasn't on the dusty stone of the market floor. He was somewhere cool, quiet, and impossibly soft. The ceiling above him glowed with a gentle blue light. Somewhere nearby, unfamiliar machines beeped in rhythm. His body felt heavy, but the pain was dulled, distant. A faint floral scent hung in the air, calming and strange. Then he heard a voice. Fascinating, it said, low and smooth, like velvet on steel. He absorbed the entire kinetic force, and still he's alive. He turned his head, slowly, painfully, and saw her. The woman from the market. But now she wasn't running. She was sitting beside him, her violet cloak replaced by a dark tunic adorned with metallic embroidery. Her hair was gathered in a regal braid that shimmered silver blue under the lights. "You saved me," she said, her voice softer now. "And for that, I owe you more than I can ever repay." Jonas blinked slowly. "That was not the plan," he muttered, voice hoarse. She smiled then, not with amusement but with something closer to curiosity, maybe even awe. "I am Lady Elantra Vera," she said, rising with grace, "heir to the high seat of Virelia, and you are no ordinary human." He tried to sit up, but her hand gently pressed him back down. Despite the situation, despite the pain, there was something comforting in her touch. "You took an arrow meant for me," she said, almost whispering, "and in doing so, you've changed everything." He didn't understand what she meant, not yet, but something in her eyes told him that his life, the quiet, wandering existence he had built, was over, and something entirely new had begun. He let out a slow breath, the kind that came after nearly dying. "Next time, maybe I just let the arrow fly." She smiled again, a little wider this time. "You won't." And in that quiet room, lit by soft lights and the pulse of ancient machines, the seed of a bond was planted. One born not of politics or prophecy, but of blood, instinct, and sacrifice. They had met by chance, but neither of them believed in coincidence anymore. Have you ever woken up in a place so foreign, so drenched in luxury and silence, that it made you question whether you were still alive at all? How do you reconcile comfort when you know pain just barely left the room? Jonas lay still for a long time. The room around him hummed softly, the walls a seamless curve of polished metal and velvet panels that pulsed with ambient light. Every breath he took was filtered, clean, filled with the faint scent of alien blossoms. But it wasn't just the air that felt strange. It was the stillness, the way silence wrapped around him like silk drawn too tight. His body, though sore, no longer screamed in pain. Instead, there was a dull, echoing throb in his back, where the arrow had pierced him. He shifted slightly, testing his limbs. Not paralyzed, and that was a good start. "You're awake." Her voice again, but this time softer, without the cold detachment of analysis. He turned his head and found her there, Elantra, seated in a reclining chair beside the medical bed, draped in a dark blue robe with high silver collars that caught the light when she moved. She looked less like a runaway and more like a queen now, and that alone raised 1,000 questions. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice rough. "In my private suite aboard the Varelian consulate ship," she replied. "We left New Thessaly hours ago. The city was compromised." Jonas frowned. "Compromised?" She tilted her head. When someone tries to assassinate a royal, it tends to unsettle trade negotiations. "Royal?" he echoed, trying to process the new weight behind that word. "So you really are—" "I wasn't lying," she said calmly. "I never said I was a commoner. You just assumed." He exhaled slowly, letting the reality settle. He hadn't saved a stranger. He'd intercepted a political disaster. And now, he was alone, injured, aboard a foreign vessel with a woman whose name would probably launch a war if anything happened to her. "I suppose I should say thank you," she continued, rising to approach the bedside, "but I don't think that's enough." "You could start by explaining why someone was shooting at you," Jonas said, trying to sit up again. She didn't stop him this time. Elantra moved with a regal poise, but there was something thoughtful in her gaze now. She poured him a glass of water from a floating decanter, handed it to him without ceremony. "My position makes me a target," she said, "internally and externally. Some factions believe the bloodline must remain pure. Others think the bloodline should end altogether." He raised an eyebrow. "And where do you stand?" She met his eyes evenly. "I stand at the edge, looking forward." Jonas drank, his throat dry, but his mind sharper with every passing second. "Why save me?" he asked. "Why not leave me bleeding in the dirt and disappear?" Elantra didn't answer right away. Instead, she sat again, folding her hands in her lap. "Because you made a choice I didn't understand. You threw yourself between me and death, without knowing who I was, without calculating benefit." He shrugged. "Seemed like the right thing at the time. And yet," she said, voice quiet, "very few do what's right without knowing the cost." There was a pause. The kind of silence that stretches not out of discomfort, but of two minds measuring one another. Finally, she leaned forward. "I want to offer you a position," she said. He blinked. "Excuse me?" "Protection detail," she clarified. "Not in title, but in proximity. Travel with me, stay close, observe. Learn." Jonas narrowed his eyes. You want a bodyguard. I want someone whose instincts I trust, she corrected. And if my instincts are right, you're not just a soldier. You're something far more dangerous. He let that sit for a moment. The idea of guarding royalty wasn't exactly how he pictured his post-war life. But something about her offer was more than political. It was personal, as if beneath the diplomacy she was trying to understand something, maybe even herself. What's the catch? He asked. She smiled faintly. You'll be near me, which, as you've seen, isn't always safe. Jonas leaned back, eyes fixed on the soft glow above. He had no home to return to, no orders, no war left to fight, only questions. And maybe, just maybe, answers lived in the spaces between this woman's words. All right, he said, I'll play along, for now. Good, she replied, because things are about to get far more complicated. What if the person you were meant to protect was also the one who could unravel everything you thought you knew about yourself? Would you still follow orders, or would you start listening to something else, something deeper? The days aboard the Virelian consulate ship passed not in haste, but in a strange, suspended rhythm. Jonas had recovered faster than anyone expected. Part of it, he suspected, was due to the alien medical tech, silent machines that hummed and blinked in elegant patterns around him. But another part was stubbornness. He didn't like lying in bed while the galaxy turned. Elantra hadn't spoken much after his acceptance of her offer. She was present, yes, often seated in the observation lounge with a digital scroll glowing before her, or speaking in hushed tones with her aides, but she was always half turned away from the world, as though carrying a weight that didn't belong to this ship, or even this time. On the fourth day, Jonas was summoned. The chamber he entered was vast and curved, its walls layered with moving constellations, projected stars from Elantra's home system. She stood in the center, not in formal robes, but in a sleeveless black suit that shimmered like midnight. The only sound was her breathing, and the faint echo of distant voices from a communication channel far below. "You've read the contract?" she asked without turning. He nodded. "Yes, though it doesn't read like any contract I've ever seen." She finally faced him. "Because it isn't one. It's a gesture, a ritual." Jonas stepped closer. "So, you're not hiring me, you're binding me?" She tilted her head slightly, considering him like a puzzle half solved. In Virelian custom, those who save a royal life must be offered proximity, not servitude, not duty. Presence. You're allowed near because your soul has already intersected with mine. "That sounds like something from a fairy tale," he said. "Or a warning," she replied quietly. They stood in silence, and then she walked toward him slowly. Jonas Cade, the human who bled for a stranger. I could assign 10 elite guards to my side, but I wouldn't trust them to act before thinking. You act on instinct, and that instinct has value. He hesitated. Is this about trust or control? "Why not both?" she asked. That answer gave him pause, not because it was threatening, but because it was honest, brutally so. She raised a slender hand, and a projection appeared between them. Not a map or a tactical feed, but a biological overlay. 2 strands of DNA, one Virelian, one unmistakably human, slowly weaving together in delicate spirals. The match glowed in soft gold. "Your blood," she said, "is compatible with mine. Not just genetically, neurologically, emotionally. Your responses resonate in patterns I've only seen once before, in a long, dead archive of hybrid ancestry." He stared at the display, then at her. "You scanned me." "I studied you," she corrected. "There's a difference. Without consent. I gave you life-saving treatment. The scans were part of recovery." He folded his arms. "And this Resonance? What does it mean? She looked at him then, not as a scientist, not as a royal, but as a woman caught between duty and something unspoken. It means, she said softly, that if you choose to remain near me, we will change, both of us. Perhaps even the way our worlds see each other. Jonas exhaled, long and slow. And if I walk away? Elantra didn't blink. Then I'll accept it, and you'll be escorted to any port of your choosing. No questions asked. The freedom in her offer was more binding than chains. He turned from the projection, pacing slowly. His mind replayed the moment in the market, the weight of her under him as the arrow hit, the warmth of her voice when she first said his name. This wasn't just a political request. You're not used to people saying no to you, he said over his shoulder. I'm not used to giving them the choice, she admitted. That, more than anything, settled it. He stepped back toward her and nodded once. Then, let's see where this goes. Her eyes softened, but her voice stayed composed. Then come with me. There's something else you should see. What happens when the truth you've known your whole life turns out to be only half the story? Would you have the courage to look beneath the surface and face what lies hidden? The corridor Elantra led him down was unlike any other Jonas had seen on the ship. It curved gently downward, illuminated by veins of soft silver light embedded in the walls, as if the very structure pulsed with memory. The air grew cooler, denser, filled with a scent that reminded him of wet stone and something floral he couldn't quite name. She walked in silence, her steps precise, her posture regal even now. Jonas followed, his boots muffled by the strange woven floor beneath them. Every now and then, Elantra would glance at him, not in challenge, but in quiet consideration, as if trying to decide where to begin. The corridor ended in a circular chamber. At its center stood a single platform surrounded by translucent panels, each one displaying data in flowing alien script and delicate diagrams. Suspended above it all, slowly rotating, was a hologram of two figures, one unmistakably Varelian, the other unmistakably human. Their forms shimmered, intertwined in strands of glowing DNA. This, she said, her voice low and steady, is what they never wanted me to see. Jonas stepped closer, studying the projection. What am I looking at? A record, she answered. Buried in the Royal Archives, sealed until I turned 25. It took me years to unlock the last layer, and what I found rewrote everything I thought I knew. He looked at her then. She wasn't regal now, she was something rawer, more uncertain. That, she continued, pointing to the human figure in the hologram, was the first of your kind to come here. A soldier, like you. He wasn't supposed to survive the atmosphere, let alone form a bond with one of ours. But he did. And from that bond came something forbidden, something sacred. Jonas folded his arms. You're telling me your family line already includes humans? She nodded. Half a millennium ago. It was erased from the official records, branded a myth. But the truth is still here, hidden in code, buried in tissue. That soldier's blood still echoes in me. And now, in you, the match is nearly perfect. Not just biologically, neurally, emotionally. He turned back to the projection, watching the strands spiral and glow. You think this means something? I know it does, she said, stepping closer. Jonas, I didn't bring you here because I needed a bodyguard. I brought you here because I needed to know if the echo was real, if the pull I felt toward you was instinct or memory, and now I know. He remained still, the weight of her words settling like gravity in his chest. He had spent his life following orders, surviving chaos, numbing himself to everything except the next breath. But here, now, In this silver-lit room, at the heart of a ship that should not have existed, a stranger was telling him that perhaps, just perhaps, he was meant for more than survival. She reached out then, her hand hovering just above his chest. "This isn't a request," she said, "and it isn't destiny, it's choice, mine and yours." The projection flickered behind her, casting shadows across her face. Her eyes, so often unreadable, now shone with something vulnerable. He took a breath, then another. Then, slowly, he placed his hand over hers. "I don't know what this is," he said, "but I know I haven't felt anything like it before." Her fingers closed around his, and in that silent moment, the chamber around them seemed to pulse, the silver light brightening just slightly as if the ship itself was holding its breath. Outside, the stars shifted, the course of the vessel adjusted, and somewhere, deep in the heart of a forgotten history, something old began to stir awake. Have you ever been so close to someone that the silence between you spoke louder than any words could? Not silence born from awkwardness, but from understanding, like two instruments tuned to the same pitch. That night, Jonas could not sleep. The lights in his quarters dimmed to a soft amber hue. Outside his window, the stars wheeled slowly, like an orchestra of burning eyes blinking across the void. He sat at the edge of his bed, shirtless, one hand tracing the scar where the arrow had been. It was almost healed now, at least on the outside. His thoughts wandered back to the projection, to the room soaked in silver, to her voice and her touch, and the way her eyes had held him without blinking. Elantra was more than a figure of mystery now. She was becoming real, tangible, and that was more dangerous than anything else. A soft chime echoed through the room. He looked up. The door slid open. She stood there, barefoot, wrapped in a long robe of woven midnight blue. Her hair was unbraided, falling past her shoulders in loose, glimmering waves. In the low light, she looked less like a princess and more like a ghost haunting her own story. "May I come in?" she asked. He said nothing, just nodded once. She stepped inside and let the door slide shut behind her. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she crossed the room and sat beside him on the edge of the bed. Her robe brushed his arm, cool and smooth, and he didn't flinch. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Me neither." She looked down at his hand. "Does it still hurt?" He flexed his fingers. "Only when I think too hard." That made her smile, a real one this time, quiet and genuine. She rested her hands in her lap and exhaled slowly. "Do you believe in echoes?" she asked. He turned his head. "Echoes?" "Not sound," she clarified. "Emotional echoes, residual threads that linger in the soul long after the moment has passed." Jonas thought about it. "I believe we carry things we can't always name. So yeah, maybe I do." She nodded as if he'd passed some invisible test. "My people used to believe that when two souls touched in sacrifice, real sacrifice, they became bonded beyond logic. A tether was formed. We don't speak of it anymore. It makes people uncomfortable." "Because it's not measurable?" he asked. "Because it's not controllable," she corrected. They sat like that for a while, the silence stretching comfortably between them. Then, without looking at him, she said, "They're going to come for me soon, not assassins, diplomats, admirals, people who think they know what's best for the crown and for me, and they won't like you." Jonas smirked. "I'm used to that." "They'll try to separate us," she continued, "convince me you're a threat, that your presence is a distraction, or worse, an infection." He looked at her then, really looked. She wasn't afraid, not for herself, but she was afraid of losing something that hadn't even fully formed yet. "Are you asking me to stay?" he said quietly. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she reached out and took his hand in hers. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it was everything. He laced their fingers together. Outside, the ship hummed steadily, moving through the darkness of space. Inside, in that quiet room, two people sat close enough to feel the shift in each other's breath. No promises were made, no declarations spoken. But something passed between them, soft as smoke, strong as steel. Whatever came next, they would face it not as strangers or protector and royalty, but as something else entirely. Something unspoken. What do you do when the world you barely understand begins to make decisions for you? Would you still follow your heart when the cost is measured in entire civilizations? Morning came slowly aboard the Varelian ship, or rather, the artificial simulation of it. A gradual brightening of the chamber lights, a shift in the ambient hum of the engines, a subtle scent of citrus in the air. It was engineered serenity, but today it felt brittle. Jonas dressed in silence. His borrowed uniform fit well, though it lacked any insignia. Neutral, unaligned, that was how they wanted him. Unaffiliated, disposable. He stood in front of the small mirror and adjusted the collar, his eyes lingering on the fading mark just above his shoulder blade, the place where the arrow had struck. Strange how quickly the body healed, the mind less so. A chime sounded, and the door slid open. It was not Elantra. A tall figure in deep gray robes entered, followed by two others dressed in ceremonial white. Their faces were calm, unreadable, their movements deliberate. Jonas Cade, the one in front, spoke, voice firm but not unkind. You are requested before the High Advisory Council. Now. Jonas didn't reply. He simply nodded and followed. They moved through the ship's inner corridors, not the polished residential halls, but older, colder passageways carved in a darker alloy. This part of the vessel wasn't meant for guests. It was meant for decisions, for power. The chamber they entered was circular, tiered like an old courtroom. In the center stood a pedestal of translucent stone, and above it a ring of hovering seats arranged in perfect symmetry. 12 counselors in shades of gray and white looked down upon him as if carved from mist and marble. Elantra stood among them, not seated, but behind the circle, hands clasped in front of her. She wore her formal garb, a flowing mantle of deep violet edged in gold, her hair braided in the traditional Varelian royal style. She didn't speak, but her eyes never left his. The lead counselor stood. Jonas Cade, he began. You are a former soldier of Earth, now displaced, unaffiliated, and previously residing on New Thessaly under a trade permit. Correct, Jonas said, voice level. You have no diplomatic status, no recognized allegiance to the Varelian Empire. And yet, you currently reside in private quarters aboard a Varelian consulate ship, under the personal protection of Princess Elantra Vera. Is this accurate? It is. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The counselor raised a hand, silencing them. You interfered in a royal assassination attempt, sustained injury, and subsequently formed proximity. That's one way to put it. The counselor's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Do you understand the implications of such proximity? I understand that I saved someone's life. Everything after that is your interpretation. Another ripple, this time more tense. Elantra stepped forward. He acted with honor, without knowledge of who I was, without expectation of reward. He did what many of our own failed to do. That is not in dispute, the counselor said. What is in dispute is what he has become since. A second panel illuminated. It showed medical scans, neural patterns, DNA sequences. We have reason to believe Mr. Cade's physiology resonates with ancestral Varelian traits. a genetic echo long thought extinct, one that could, under certain conditions, influence royal succession. Jonas frowned. "I'm sorry. Are you suggesting I'm royalty?" "No," the counselor said calmly. "We're suggesting your presence could complicate the line of succession. Politically, culturally, emotionally." Another panel lit up, showing Jonas and Elantra standing in the silver chamber, their hands touching. "It is clear a bond has formed." Jonas didn't look away. The counselor continued. "The question before this council is not one of legality. It is one of stability. What path ensures peace?" Elantra's voice cut through the chamber. "Peace built on erasure is not peace, it's sedation." That silenced the room. She stepped fully into the circle, standing beside Jonas now. "He is not a threat, he is a reminder that our past is not as pure as we pretend, that maybe, just maybe, our future doesn't have to be so narrow." The counselor regarded her. "You risk much, Princess." "I risk everything," she said, "because he did." Jonas felt the weight of 100 eyes on him, but none of them mattered, only hers. The counselor turned. "Very well, we will deliberate." They were escorted out, side by side, neither speaking until the door sealed behind them. "That went well," Jonas muttered. Elantra gave a weary smile. "For Varelians, no one died. That's a good start." They walked in silence for a moment before Jonas asked, "What happens if they say no?" She stopped, looked up at him. "Then we make them regret it." Have you ever felt the weight of something looming, like a shadow forming behind the horizon, too distant to touch but too real to ignore? What would you do if peace became the quietest lie of all? Hours passed since the council session. No verdict had been announced, no message delivered, yet the ship felt different, as if the walls themselves were listening. Even the crew moved differently, straighter backs, quicker glances, whispers traded behind closed doors. It was the kind of silence Jonas remembered from wartime, the kind that came right before the sky fell in fire. He sat alone in the observation deck, the lights dimmed to a faint cobalt glow. Before him, a wall of transparent metal revealed the slow dance of space, stars drifting in endless procession. His reflection hovered faintly in the glass, older than it should be, more tired than he liked to admit. Behind him, soft footsteps. "You always sit facing the stars," Elantra said gently. He didn't turn. "They don't argue, they don't demand answers." She stepped beside him, her presence warm despite the cold light. "They do demand something," she said. "Patience." Jonas chuckled. "I've never had much of that." "Then it's time you learned." They stood in silence for a while. Then he asked, "Do you believe they'll let this go?" "Let us go?" "No," she said plainly. "But they'll pretend, for now." He turned toward her. "What aren't you telling me?" Elantra hesitated, then sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. "When I was a child," she began, "they told me I would rule, not just sit on a throne but define it, reshape it. I was trained in 23 dialects, 5 forms of combat, and every law etched into Varelian stone. And no one ever told me how to feel," she said, voice steady. "They taught me what to sacrifice, not what to trust." Jonas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "And now you're trusting me." She nodded. "That's the part that terrifies them." Another silence passed, thicker this time, not uncomfortable but charged. "Earlier today," she continued, "I received a private transmission from a faction on the inner moon. They claim to have documents, records of the original hybrid union, the one from the archives. They say it was never erased, it was hidden." Jonas straightened. "That's proof." "It's danger," she said. If that record becomes public, it won't unite. It will ignite. He ran a hand through his hair. And you're thinking of retrieving it. I'm thinking of what happens if we don't. The room darkened further as the artificial day cycle approached night. Somewhere deep in the ship, the engines changed tone, barely perceptible. But Jonas noticed. You already ordered the course change, he said. I had to, she replied. He turned to her. You should have told me. I just did. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he reached out, gently touching her wrist. If we do this, there's no turning back. I never intended to, she said. Their hands found each other again, fingers intertwining like threads finally aligning. Not out of desperation, but conviction. Beyond the window, a star pulsed slowly. A new trajectory was forming, and in that shifting light, something between them solidified. Not a romance born of impulse, but a loyalty forged in defiance. Whatever lay ahead, betrayal, battle, exile, it would not find them unprepared. There comes a moment when everything slows down. Not because the world grows calmer, but because the next step will change everything. And in that breath, when silence stretches like the skin of a drum, you begin to understand who you really are. The Virelian ship descended into the atmosphere of the inner moon without ceremony. There were no banners, no salutes, only shadows. The surface below was a jagged maze of ravines and frozen lakes, dotted with ancient ruins, structures half swallowed by time. It was here, buried beneath ash and secrecy, that the first bond between human and Virelian had taken shape, and it was here they hoped to find the truth. Jonas stood by the loading ramp, armored again, but not as a soldier. His gear was lighter, more practical, no insignia, just a man walking into unknown history with a heart steadier than it had ever been in war. Elantra walked beside him, robed in black with a single golden clasp at her collar. She carried no weapons, only a sealed orb in her hand. A translator, a recorder, and a beacon all in one. The team they brought was small, trusted, loyal. But even then, Jonas noticed how often they looked toward Elantra with eyes not of reverence, but of fear. The kind of fear that forms when someone refuses to be controlled. The entrance to the vault was hidden beneath layers of synthetic moss and volcanic glass. Jonas helped uncover it, and when the circular door finally groaned open, stale air rushed out like a whisper. Inside, the walls glowed with faint pulses, reacting to Elantra's presence. The ship's tech had prepared her retinal scans, her pulse signature. It knew her. They walked slowly down the corridor, each step stirring centuries of dust. The silence was sacred. Then they reached the final chamber. A single pedestal stood at the center. Upon it, a memory crystal, old, cracked, but alive. Elantra stepped forward, placed the orb beside it, and activated the link. Images bloomed. A human man, scarred and smiling. A Virelian woman, proud and radiant. They stood beneath a flag neither Jonas nor Elantra recognized. Their hands clasped. Their voices, translated, overlapped. We were not meant to collide, but we did. And from that collision came not ruin, but music. The room held its breath. This was not just record, it was confession, declaration, a testament left behind in hope that someone would find it and remember. Elantra turned slowly to Jonas. Do you see now? He nodded. I see what they feared, and why they still should. They did not take the crystal. They did not upload or broadcast it. They simply stood and listened again. And when they returned to the surface, to the waiting ship and the waiting eyes, they said nothing. Some truths are not meant to be wielded like weapons. Some are meant to be planted, like seeds. Back aboard the ship, Jonas sat with Elantra in the same quiet lounge where stars once spoke only of distance. Now, they spoke of possibility. "I never expected this," he said softly. "No one ever does," she replied. "But it finds you anyway." He turned to her, really seeing her not as royalty, not as alien, but as someone carved by choice and consequence just like him. "What now?" he asked. Elantra leaned back, her gaze on the dark beyond. "Now, we wait, we let the truth grow. And when the time comes, we protect it." Jonas nodded, his hand finding hers. In the background, the stars moved in slow procession. Their war was not over. But for the first time, it would not be fought with fire. It would be fought with memory, and with the simple, stubborn act of choosing each other. If you've come this far with us, tell me, what do you think deserves to be remembered? Share it below. I'll be waiting to read every word.